Hi everyone, welcome to Dracast episode 2. I'm here today again with Sanct, and Anairi, and we wanted to talk to you a bit about the history of group combat in ESO. The main reason for this is that we see a lot of newer players coming into the game, whether that's a few months old or a year or slightly more, who've never really experienced the old large-scale campaign battles and gameplay of that original era within ESO. A lot of these players are often highly influenced by more popular videos or streams, such as 1vx gameplay, which, whilst a good variety of gameplay, it can often also come along with very negative attitudes towards groups and group roles. There are a lot of questions also and discussions about the current Destro meta and how it affects gameplay at the moment, and during these discussions it often becomes clear that players have kind of forgotten about what is actually passed in the game and how the game has led up to this point. So to start with, we want to take everyone back to the different stages of the game and discuss what sort of abilities and playstyles were being used by groups back in those days, so that everyone can have the same sort of understanding about how the game has progressed up to this point.
Yeah, we want to take you down a trip down memory lane and just recap how it used to be for us, basically. One prominent definition of how the game used to be when it came out, from my eyes, was how effective one player could be. Things like dynamic ult really emphasized this and gave power to smaller groups and smaller numbers. I can understand completely like its removal. It was overpowered and it just allowed some builds to be too strong. I think a better response to that would have been nerfing those classes or those builds in particular, rather than necessarily removing dynamic ult. But that's a decision they made, and you know the metas evolved from there. Regardless, back then, one good amp with a good build, dynamic ultigen, could change any fight. We saw it all the time. Impulse was the spammable of choice, so groups were running around. You know, it allowed their damage to be more constant and mobile, whereas like versus now, it's a bit more structured and like comes in waves. But it was more consistent then, and yeah.
Yeah, so obviously as you mentioned, Impulse was the main AoE of choice, although there were other AoEs. For example, you had Liquid Lightning, Talon, Sap, Burning Spear. All of these were 8 meter range. You know, they all brought something individual, so the classes were all useful. When you go into a fight, you'd have, you know, ultimates like Negate and Banner and Barrier, and they would be basically the mainstays. So you'd have your Sorks and your DKs on Negate and Banner, and pretty much everyone else on Barrier.
Yeah, I can also add about how healing was back in those days. It was so much easier. The only thing you need to do is use your movable and just run around spamming healing springs to charge your ulti or spam Breath of Life. And Breath of Life cost so much less, healed more players and went through the walls. You could literally spam it almost forever. Then on top of this, multiple types of barriers used to stack together too. I can say that running a 24-man raid was almost impossible to kill, and so many more players used to run in really big groups.
The population was just generally higher back then as well, though, so you have to consider that. Like they had more people to fight, they were contested by more other large groups, so that's a factor that led to larger group size as well.
I think like a big factor why people have those days in mind as like much better compared to now is that back then it was like there were so many pugs everywhere. So like, when you had like a smaller group and you went somewhere, there was always like huge zergs of pugs. Like especially like at launch, there was like 100-man zergs, literally 100 people following like a scroll, and they were like all pugs and all so bad. You could just go there with like your 8-man group of like people that figured out the game mechanics and were like using the broken skills at the time, and just kill those 100 people, like literally all those 100 people with your 8-man group, and you would feel like numbers weren't so important. But if you tried to kill like a really good 24-man group back then, it was literally almost impossible, because there was no real counter to it, because every negate you could just cast immovable and heal through everything.
Yeah. And barriers as well.
And there was like no real counter whatsoever, and there was AoE caps in place, so you could only damage 6 people with your AoE skills. So I
It's
think
funny.
like if you if they would revert the changes that were made between back then and now, people would complain so much about groups because it's so easy to kill a group nowadays with vicious death, with Destro, with negates that you cannot just CC break. It's so easy to kill a big group, and back then none of those things existed. Like you got some more ultimate maybe, but like it doesn't help you like if they just heal through all your ultimates without even like looking at you. So I
Funny
think
you
it's-
mentioned immovable as well, because back then we didn't have immovable pods. People were, or we did, but they were not as effective. People were actually using the immovable ability. That's ability that was lost and nerfed down as well. So groups were literally immovable as they were running around. Like it was a ability that was a necessity on any group member's bar back then.
And
I think it lasted
remember,
8 seconds or something.
Yeah, remember on top of that, like on top of mobile, they could just cast rapid once, and then you can't really do anything to this group at all. They're just running around, killing everything.
Yeah, I mean, like being able to purge and heal and everything like this whilst having rapids on was so strong. And we were inside keeps with, literally, as Sanct said, hundreds of players attacking us as being, 16 to 24, and we just wouldn't die.
I think like the most important skill during that time was negate. Compared to now, back then it removed every effect that was placed inside of the negate, even after you placed it. So you drop the negate, and then if someone spammed healing springs on the negate, it would remove every single healing springs that was placed there, and it would give yourself 15% max magicka for every effect that was removed. It would also heal everyone in your group for, I believe, also 15% of their max health, or like basically some ridiculous amount. So if you had the negate while you were fighting, like if you had the negate active while you were fighting the other group, you're basically immortal. So it was really, really important in group fights to have the final negate. Nowadays it's still quite important because they buffed it again, but it's still nowhere near as powerful as back then, because it would also remove, for example, ground ultimates like Banner that was placed there, or Nova or Veil. And back then there was no Destro ultimate, for example, so almost all good ultimates were ground placed ultimates, and negate removed all of them. So it was really the maker or breaker. And the other very powerful ultimate back then that Izanerys already mentioned was Banner, which was kind of because, like, on the one hand, Decay was just a really, really strong class, like with dynamic ultimate compared with the battle draw passive, and also Banner was still like a really, really powerful ultimate, as it would reduce healing from enemy groups. Back then it was 35% more damage done inside your own banner and 35% less damage taken. So like just one banner on another group would just melt them, kinda.
Yeah, so back then as well, synergies were a critical group tool. I mean, you had, as I mentioned before, Liquid Lightning, Talons, and Orb, and things like that. And all of them were huge damage to enemy groups. And in raids, you'd literally just hear, spam X, just over and over again. And Orbs were so broken back then. You'd also get to the situation where people didn't want you casting things such as Veil. That was
Purify.
Yeah, Purify as well. Like, people were always like, "Oh, don't cast these skills that have useless synergies." I mean, you had Necrotic Orb, which when people first started to use that, it was so ridiculously strong. All these orbs would explode when one synergy was used, and just literally wipe an enemy group flat in a second.
Yeah, so like basically how Orb worked back then was that if you had someone, or like maybe multiple people spamming the orb, and there was like 10 orbs floating around, and you press the synergy, all those orbs would instantly explode for a decent amount. Like, they would rather like pulse for a big amount of damage, and it would also increase the dot from like being close to the orbs. So if you have like 10 orbs floating around, and then you have 10 people person synergy, and make like causing all those orbs to pulse for AoE damage of like what is maybe comparable to nowadays like 6-7k tooltip damage. You can just like imagine how much burst it was.
Yeah, you also have to consider not just the abilities available back then, but also the fact we were working with reduced stats and soft caps. So it meant builds weren't as front-loaded as they are today, and generally speaking, everyone's attributes sat at similar levels to one another. Everyone's spell damage and weapon damage were much more similar to one another's as well. This was also attributed to by, like, obviously there was less sets in the game back then, so you have to consider that. And in my opinion, that's not so bad. That has some upsides. So, like, a lot of other competitive environments I've been in had a general philosophy that if you give everyone the same tools to work with, if you make everyone use the same or similar stuff, it becomes more about who's better with those tools than any other outside factors. Obviously, this is an MMO, so naturally it's implied there would be more emphasis on build diversity, but nonetheless, it's a factor we have to consider when thinking about how people's builds evolved over the patches, etc. You also have to consider how that affected the growth of the game back then. So fewer sets, soft cap stats, no champion points to grind. It all meant that there was less of a checklist of things new players needed to do before he or she could viably jump into PvP. It was basically get a good 5-set piece. More than likely it was crafted at that point. Then just add a couple of 2 or 3 set like bonuses from random other sets. We didn't have monster helms. We didn't have best in slot master or maelstrom weapons. We didn't have sets like agility or willpower. So whether or not you think the addition of all these things was healthy for the game, regardless, it meant it was harder to start from nothing.
Like, to be honest, I think, yeah, it like wasn't really about who was better as a player. It was like, for me, like during those early days of ESO, it was who found the broken skills, because like especially in 2014, like every meta was some ridiculously broken skill. First we had like Bat Swarm was literally would cost 0 ultimate for Sork, with former Emperor passive or like 4 ultimate if you didn't have former Emperor. So you can like you just spam it. You don't use any other skill, you just spam bats, and after that got like removed, you still had like the necrotic orbs. Like if you figured that out as like one of the first groups, and then you would just like win fights because the other group wouldn't have it, and it was kind of hard to get back then. Or like with the fragmented shield, basically fragmented shield would, if you cast it, could go to 6 other people in your group, and on each of them it would explode for AoE damage. So basically you could hit like, it was like basically one cast was 6 AoEs. So if you just spammed that and you fought a lot of enemies and they didn't know about it, you would just wreck them just because you had that know-how, kinda. So I think like that was a really, really big factor back then.
I was remembering, back then obviously you had things like reflects and all this stuff, and I don't really remember Meteor being used sort of in 2014 as much, just because there were so many more strong ultimates,
Yeah,
and
I
the
think
chance
they,
of reflecting as well.
I think they buffed it at some point as well. Like I remember back then it didn't have any indicator where it would hit, and I think it was also like a smaller radius maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that DKs was so prominent, you had pretty much a 50% chance of anyone you dropping it on sending it back at you, so it was a pretty risky move.
Yeah.
So after, that sort of initial meta, things changed a bit and players went more for healing bats or invis bats and just general sort of boosted AoE damage, trying to combat other groups. You also had the introduction of, bugs such as the blockade purge bug, where whenever a pug or someone purged you, if you were standing on a blockade, you'd pretty much instantly die because all the ticks would happen at once. And, you'd just been training your pugs for a year to kind of purge as you're going in a breach, and then, it's instantly killing you. Not to mention that the other morph blockade, unstable elements, also was completely uncapped on its explosion, so it wouldn't just hit 6 people. So players that knew about that would really profit from, fighting large groups inside a breach. You just put one oil down, so they had to purge, and then, they'd just instantly die from that. And if you did die, then there was a camp somewhere on the map that you could just instantly res at. No cooldown, nothing, just one of your members gets out, places a camp, everyone can insta-res there. And I think that's also why the fights were a lot more spread out as well, because there was no range conditioning on camps. Like, you could literally res anywhere on the map and make a offensive attack there. So quite often in our groups, we'd have people going out to, say, Farragut or Arius and starting to siege it, put up a camp, and then when we died, we'd go back and res there instantly. And it just meant like the map was so much more active. Like it was really like the first thing that changed when they removed camps was that fights just became so narrow on the map. Like the bridge would just become the only fight, whereas before people could just bypass it by resing simply at a camp somewhere else.
I remember the day they removed camps from the game. Starting from this day, the game became how we know it now, full of Zergs that go from one keep to another with 1 or 2 big fights on the map. And in my opinion, what they did to the camps was the most important change in the history of ESO PVP. No matter what they were trying to do after this, the game never recovered back to the point it was before. We now have such a static and very predictable map where barely anything changes. Zergs go to Alessia, then to the bridge, then to Sejanus and BRK, or other way around, or from Bleakers to Chalmon. Just because without camps, Citadel became a massive riding simulator, and people are too lazy to ride somewhere because it actually takes quite a lot of time to ride around from one point to another. And before you knew that even if you lose fight, there might be another camp somewhere completely other side of the map with a different, interesting fight to take part in. Camps could be in completely random places, and whole raids could spawn there if they knew there is another organized guild fighting in that place. That's why fights were so much more interesting, unpredictable, and spread out. And in addition to this, playing for campaign also was very important to many players, and it actually had rewards at those times, like master weapons, for example.
I think it's funny, just generally speaking about the game, and this goes on to a lot of other abilities. You already talked about how necrotic orbs worked and that, but generally speaking, it's funny how many problems or bugs within the game become the meta and become part of the meta because they stick around and aren't solved or balanced for so long. Like it says a lot. It speaks highly to how the PvP environment is through like every stage of the meta.
Yeah, and that's why it hasn't really ever changed. I mean, even now there aren't particularly so many bugs to exploit, and people still, there's still the considered overpowered skills. Back then it was kind of actually really bugs, or these skills got fixed fairly fast. I mean, Frag Shield got fixed really quickly in comparison to maybe if people think Destro is overtuned now. Frag Shield back in the day was insane in comparison. You just have a couple of DKs spamming it, and that's more damage than a Destro even could possibly put out by 10 guys now.
Even bugs like Purge of Death, though, like the fact that that's becomes part of the meta is quite humorous.
I actually really liked that bug as like if it was a game mechanic in a way, because I feel with groups in ESO there's not so much you can do wrong at many times. You can like just if you're like a purge guy, you can just spam purge. You can like drink a coffee to the side, maybe. If it's not some intense fight, of course. But I mean, like during that time, like if you press purge at the wrong time and there was like one guy spamming walls on you, and you just press purge and then bam, everyone dead in your group. These kind of mechanics, I think it's quite nice to have it in a way, because it makes it much more challenging. I think it's different again because you have vicious death, so like one guy sleeping in your raid can still like just wipe you.
So you're saying these kind of things add a level of counterplay? Yeah, they remove any room, like they add more room for error.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like with all those bugged skills, like on the one hand, of course, they need to be nerfed, but I think Zenimax overdid it with like nerfing to some extent in a way, because now there's really not, except like maybe proccing vicious death on your group, there's like nothing you can really do completely wrong. Like you can still like of course be a bad player and have like low impact, but it's not like you really need to actually think about stuff. If you can join a good group and have no impact, but you won't like drag them down super much as well. And I think it's nice for like beginners in a way, but on the other hand, there should always be some challenges in a way that beginners have to learn. Maybe like learn them just like by the pain kind of it causes you.
Yeah.
Just some stuff that you can actually do wrong and have like a
Yeah, I
impact
gotcha.
by it.
So, I mean, going from 2014, obviously, lag started to be introduced as a nice new feature by ZOS, and I just like remember these forests of banners inside keeps. You'd have like DKs could drop, like 40 banners just because the game wouldn't be registering them, and at some point you would be able to use the synergy and wipe everyone in the keep, and being able to do that as a 4-man group because no other damage was kind of going through, only healing and barriers and stuff. I mean, it was just ridiculous back then. And people complain about the lag now compared to how it was, late 2014, especially in 2015. Just have no idea how bad it was. I mean, obviously there's a lower population now, but the difference between that, like, lighting patch that apparently there was nothing wrong with it, and before it and after it was just so stark to see in the game.
Oh, so this was around like 2015. This was the Steel Tornado kind of meta. Proxy debt was introduced, which is huge for groups, like huge. It was introduced with the cast time, so it's not the proxy debt you know now. I personally thought the cast time was kind of cool because it added, like we were talking about, it added a level of technicality to how you had to implement it. You had to find time for your group to get line of sight to cast it on themselves, and it was also a shorter debt time. You only had 5 seconds to get to where you were engaging, so there was a level of skill added there with it. A lot of groups found their kind of stride in this meta. It was a really cool balance for Stam as well, because previously Stam hadn't been very prominent, but here Steel Tornado and in Vizbat Steel Tornado, these were huge things for this meta. Personally, I really liked it. This was one of my favorite metas. It was a lot more like balanced between the levels of different classes and what they could all contribute. There are a few things that were a bit too strong. The first example that comes to my head would be Kagnarak's healers, like tanky Kagnarak's healers. Just spamming Breath of Life. Breath of Life, as Anairi was saying, is so strong for the early years of the game. And yeah, you could res someone within a second. It was probably a bit ridiculous, but I don't know if you guys have any like highlights from this meta or how you felt about it, but it was definitely one of my favorites.
I mean, personally, I liked the Dato, like the Magicka meta. I think I liked a lot. It was actually kind of challenging. I mean, in the end, of course, you just went around some line of sight and had to cast Datos then and then pushed, but it was still like much more. Like it required much more thought than just detonation in 3, 2, 1. Now let's go over there. But you actually have to like get yourself in a position where you can cast it without getting interrupted. But I think the stamina meta I really didn't like, because Steel Tornado had such a huge range, and especially if you played in like a 24-man group and you could just stand still and spam Steel Tornado, and everyone who would come close to you to like actually maybe bomb you with detonation would just instantly die to your Steel Tornadoes, especially if you abused the Sharpen bug, which gave you like 30k penetration back then. Actually, like if you had sharpened weapons, it would give you 30k penetration without having to do anything. So
again, an example of
it was
bugs
just like
becoming
really,
part of the
really
meta.
easy in a way to have like a big group, just stand still, spam Steel Tornado and maybe Healing Springs and just defensive stuff and rotate barriers, and you would like not really die to any small bomb group or anything, and then like even like against huge enemy, like huge amounts of enemies, you would just be fine if you just stand still and spam Steel Tornado, just because of how big the range was. So yeah, I really liked the Magicka meta, but the stamina meta I didn't like so much back then.
On top of that, you forgot to mention Caltrops with Camo Hunters that were taking for an insane amount of damage. And I remember people even in raid guilds were using this skill. And I remember standing there trying to fight them. and having my Destro card with insane amount of call drop sticks, it was something crazy back in those days, because like how mechanic of this game used to work.
One thing I would like to add as well is that in 1.6 stamina builds got stronger because before that you never really had a good self-heal. You had only rally, but then given you had a high enough alliance rank, you could get Vigor for like a really good self-heal in 1.6. So especially especially in raid where you could just like cast Vigor and it would heal everyone, it's like really strong. But also it kinda was the start of where you could play stamina builds and like solo or smaller groups more effectively. Because before that it was like you could like some people played it in like even before that, but it was never really best in slot at all. But in 1.6 it started to get better. So like more and more people started to experiment with it. And yeah, I mean in raid it was obviously like really easy to use. But yeah, like I think Vigor is a big factor too.
So with Steel Tornado having such a huge radius, groups kind of had to, who were smaller than the Steel Tornado group, kind of had to work out how to combat that. So quite often it would be versus burst damage, so you'd go in with your proxy dead bombers and just try and get in before the ticks of Steel Tornado could build up. And also dropping meteors was a huge thing as well. And of course it helped that Meteor was extremely bugged in those days.
Yeah. What Izanagi means that like back then, for those of you who don't know exactly, if you cast Meteor and was a bit laggy, and especially if the enemy group was on like some stairs, they would get rolled back and take like 60k fall damage and just instantly die, which was just like...
Regarding stamina as well, as we move on, like stamina grew even more popular as we moved into 2016 and further patches with the introduction of like proc sets and Black Rose. The meta for this was really good small scale meta. I was actually not here for a lot of this meta for group play, but small scale took a huge like up point at this time. And stamina became really strong, almost to the point where it was broken, especially for single target and stuff like that.
A lot of the reason why stamina became more sort of efficient in smaller groups especially was mainly because of the rapid and purge changes that started to come in around that time as well. I mean, with rapids being changed so that basically anything you did lost rapids rather than just damage, it meant that you couldn't really escape anymore as a group if you didn't have a dedicated rapids or purger. And you know, as a stamina guy, you could just use shuffle, you could use forward momentum, and you still can. That's why stamina is so much better as a sort of a basic level in smaller groups. Not only is it generally better burst, and you have a lot of sustain anyway, just from sort of constant hots with vigor, but the movement is so much better in stamina. And even in heavy armor, although maybe we'll see a bit of difference next patch, that's still not an issue for a stamina build compared to a magicka build.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It's funny to hear that groups, people talk about groups only ever being benefited by the patch changes, when this patch was a foremost case example of groups being reined in a lot by the balance. So like you said, like changing rapids, changing purge, so it was all group oriented only. Vicious Death obviously lent a lot to the strength of groups damage, but so much more of it was changed. You couldn't just generalize your role, like multitasking your role became less effective, and you really had to refine down to what you were doing. Like you could no longer just casually have a rapids as your off skill. You had to focus on really getting it on the group repeatedly. So I think groups are definitely reined in compared to what a lot of people might think.
Yeah, I think what Vile just said is like a really big point, because ever before that you could kind of play your 1vx build in raid in a way and just be effective with it. And I think it's maybe what people prefer to do. Like maybe people, like, at least from what I see in the community most of the time, people don't really like this focusing on one role playstyle as much. But it was really that patch where it started that you have to do it for like to be effective, because it's just so much more effective if you have a very high damage Nightblade that focuses on like big AoE damage and like back then I guess burst with soul tether and just explode people with vicious death. And with stamina builds it's just so much more reliable to have a guy that has 4 or 5k recovery and just cast maneuver all the time than to have maybe a couple of stam DDs that cast maneuver when it's needed, because now you need maneuver all the time. So I think that's like a really, really big factor as to why groups like start to decline from that point. Another thing that I would like to mention about these changes is that I think like it affected Zerg surfing a lot as well, or like the popularity of Zerg surfing. Because if you have like 50 pugs with you that you can hide behind, you don't really need as much support stuff. You don't need rapid as much. You don't need purge as much. So you can, if you like just pug surf, you can still play your maybe not as, let's say, raid optimized build. You can just run a bit less damage and you still are successful in a way, because you just hide behind the pugs and then you bomb some other group when they're distracted and you can feel good about yourself. I think before that it was, let's say, much easier to go away from your pugs, because you didn't go slowed all the time, you didn't get sieged as much, maybe they didn't die to siege as much. So I think that's an aspect as well that should be considered.
Then it all changed. 2017, we get Destro. Damage is more skilled than ever. It's really hard to bring in. Yeah, who wants to start on Destro on Storms? How do you want to?
It wasn't 2017, it was last year. In 2017, they actually nerfed it in Homestead. And Homestead was straight after New Year's holidays.
Wow,
at the end of
times,
January or something.
Yeah, it's
Time
been
goes so
Destro
quick.
for a long time. I mean,
yeah.
It feels
Of-
like they brought in Destro like fucking yesterday.
No,
Yeah.
it was way much more broken in 2016 when they just implemented it in
We had
the
like
game. It was
10k tooltip.
Yeah, it was completely something crazy. And then in Homestead they nerfed it for kinda a bit.
when they first decided to add weapon ults, obviously people were very excited. It's something that they'd been asking for a long time. More ult use, it had gotten very stale. A typical raid was basically throw as many tether bombers in a raid as you can, because they are not only more effective at regaining ulti, they have a very good AoE burst that healed them. They could time with proxy. You could even use bats with it, invis bats. Nightblades would be buffed by invis. So that was the meta for almost a year, I think, to have tether or invis bats with proxy. That was when raids really became very class focused. Before that time you could run pretty much any class in your raid, and those classes could play any role. After this time, it became, and that was like the introduction of Vicious Death caused this. It became very much, you need a Nightblade as damage. You can kind of get away with a DK or a Sork, still no Templars, sorry. But after this, it became more and more, DKs got nerfed, Sorks got sort of nerfed, although eventually Negate got buffed. And that's actually another change that came in, I believe, with the Destro ults, is that Negates became... it was a bit before that, because we had a very, very short window of Stamina Sorks being like the best class possible. You had Steel Tornado and Negate, which couldn't be broken free from. But apart from that small window, sort of between these two patches, then Destro ult came out, and initially everyone was like, "Oh, this Destro ult is so rubbish. It needs buffs. It's not good enough. We wanted something much better." And people were saying, "Oh, we're never going to use this skill. It's just so bad." And then when it actually came to life, as we said in the last podcast, it was so good. A movable
game.
ulti, exactly like bats, but apart from healing you, it did twice the damage, and it couldn't be blocked. It meant that it was kind of bats on steroids, really.
I mean, bats can't be blocked either.
Yeah, but I mean, bats only does half the damage. So.
Yeah. I mean, just like
clarification. Destro, definitely, it changed the game completely. It like you said, it definitely tunnel visioned a lot of the DPS roles and classes. Like damage for a group and guild gameplay, organized raid gameplay became much more wave consistent. Not only due to the cost of storms and having to rebuild it for your raid, but also because you had to get out of damage from just pugs and the groups you were fighting. You couldn't just move around in the open field as freely. You had to move to LOS more now because the damage creep was huge. Like, it was everywhere. So Destro not only is beneficial for large groups, but it's also their downside as well. They can't just sit in people's Destro ults. So everything became more wave-based rather than consistent damage. Healing's really strong as well this patch with Destro. So, like, people complain about it a lot, but if you take it out, I really don't see. I think if you took out Destro, you'd see groups going back to more like they were in the first early eras of the game, and just being nearly impossible to kill. Like, I don't think the other ultis could burn through the heals at this point in the game. The issue I personally take with Destro is how it specifically tunnel visions DPS for a raid into that one Nightblade class. It just perfectly fits in with. It's the same range as Sap. It's the same range as Grothdar. Your Sap Essence is healing you. Nightblade is just the perfectly built class for DPS. Other damage actually hinders your raid because Nightblade. If you steal the Nightblade's killing blows, you're not getting your Destros back as fast. That's the problem I take with it. That it really just tunnel visions it down to that one class.
I mean, to be fair though, as Izanagi pointed out earlier, even before that, Nightblade was kind of the best in slots damage class with like Soul Tether. So I think like Nightblade is just the best, mostly because you have Sap, which is an 8-meter AoE, and like 8-meter AoE is almost twice the area of a 6-meter AoE. So it's like much more damage from your AoE. So the only other class that has an 8-meter AoE is Templar, actually, with like the Solar Barrage and Blazing Spears. But Nightblade has just far superior passives. So I don't think that Destro necessarily like tunnel visions the roles more than it was before.
You don't think it was more like the straw that broke the camel's back, though? It was just that final thing that really said, all right, nothing but Nightblade.
I mean, I guess the
DPS
thing
in
is
raid.
though. I mean, I guess the thing is that like Nightblade was always maybe, let's say, 10% better than every other class, but I guess just because of the power creep, the like 10% with Destrolls is like
bigger 10%,
so much more extra damage than 10% without Destrolls, I guess. So in a way, I guess like you feel the difference more. But I would definitely say that Nightblade was, like, even before that, best in slot Magicka damage dealer.
Yeah, the thing with the power creep as well is, moving on to HP and how HP is affecting raids this meta, you see a lot of complaints about the tank meta, people getting tankier, people getting more HP in general. If you want to blame this on anything, blame it on the power creep, the damage creep. It's a cause and effect, in my opinion. Like, if you give more damage, people have to build tankier to survive it. So that's where that comes from, in my opinion, for groups and just for general gameplay. The people I think who suffer most from this are small scale players, and I really do feel for them at times, because when you've got everyone who has to be tankier just to live throughout Cyrodiil, it makes it a lot harder for groups that don't have these Destroids going off to wipe out huge numbers, because they're still trying to play with all these other tools, and they're just not as effective as they used to be, especially when everyone's building to survive a Destro, you know?
I think, just quickly going back to the main difference between the end of 2016 and 2017, for me, and in my eyes, was the way people are starting to heal. It became, obviously Templars were always the class to go to for healing, but previously healing could still be done by other classes, whereas end of 2016 you had Remembrance, which was just this huge damage mitigation for everyone, and one Remembrance could basically just save your entire raid. You had major protection tied into it, and that got taken away with Morrowind patch and given to the Wardens instead. And that was a big change. When the Wardens came in, you had this class that on paper looks very, very good for raids. They have a timeable burst skill, Shulks. They have AoE damage mitigation and damage and snare and everything else it does. You stun, like a stun that's so strong that you can't even break free from it for the first 2 or 3 seconds normally. And that sort of kind of all comes together to create this environment where not only can you take a lot of damage very, very quickly, but also you can be stunned very, very quickly as a whole raid. You can't really move out of this damage like you could with the previous patches, because it's not just a burst of damage, it's a sustained wave, as you said. You pop Destro ult, it's there for like 5 seconds of damage. Sleet is there for 7 seconds of damage and stun and mitigation. Like, everything combines together now to make it like you can move. If you can move and you can do damage on the move, as long as you have enough damage, you can basically just plow through everything. And that's where, like, tying it back into what you're saying about why HP is important now, is because in order to get out of that situation, you need to be able to survive long enough to move and, move faster than the enemy can damage you. So all these groups that run very, very low HP and hope that they never die with their low HP, partly aren't really helping themselves, because for a start, a lot of them say, oh well, I won't run this ulti that's designed to fight enemy groups because I think it's, not skillful or whatever. For a start, it's designed for that. That's why it was brought into the game, is to combat that type of group. But like groups like ours have built ourselves to combat that change. And, I don't understand why people are so against a raid trying to combat a change which was intended to be against it. Like, that's the biggest thing.
I wouldn't even say I'm annoyed that people are against it. It's just I don't understand why people would be surprised by it. When you consider the nature of how a group fight goes, it's, as you said, you need time. It's a matter of time. HP level is allowing you time. You get negated, you get CC'd, and you get burst down by these waves. So health just allows you a gap between getting negated, breaking free, and before vicious death. It's essentially an equation between those two things. Your healers have to get out of the gates, re-heal your group. So I just don't understand how people are surprised by it.
I think also like a different thing about the HP is that I think people focus a bit too much on like, oh yeah, look, this guy has 30k HP, or like with Plague Doctor maybe even 35 or 37k. He's a tank guy, he cannot do any damage. Like, I read on so many threads on the forum saying that basically Plague Doctor Nightblades are tank builds in a way, and it's just not true. Like, if you look at the stats you can reach, I mean, right now on my Nightblade Bomber I have 40k Magicka, 3k spell damage and 28k health. So with those stats you still deal a ton of damage, and if you reduce your health to like the lowest possible to boost your Magicka to 44k, you're not gonna kill anything more because you already have so much damage that you kill people. So that 8k or like maybe 6k extra health that you get just allows you to be more offensive as well, because if you play a really low health build, you maybe have to shield yourself more to survive, and basically instead of casting stab maybe to do damage or put like walls or path down or something, you just cast defensive skills to survive, and at that point having more health also increases your damage output passively.
Also, from a healing point of view, when people run high burst DPS builds in light armor without high enough HP, they're just too squishy. It's extremely hard to keep them alive. Even if you cast Remembrance or spam Breath of Life of them, they just die in no time because of huge amount of single target, or because they gap close too far or get stuck for some other reason. And at this point, it's even a question, why do you have this guy in your raid with build that provide high damage, but dies so fast that he can push somewhere only once and then he's dead? And I think it also shows the problem of the groups that rely on players like this to carry their first push with enough damage. If they don't kill enough, then they are basically screwed and unable to push again for a long time, and likely have to rest or place a camp for dead who overextended.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for me, the HP isn't actually so much about countering Destro, because if you just fight like another group and let's say like a GVG fight with equal amount of people, I don't think you really need a lot of help in those fights, because you can just counter Destro by movement. Like if you just spread out a bit, they're not gonna kill you even if you have a bit low health most of the time. But I think where the health really comes into play is when you are really outnumbered inside enemy keeps, for example, and you have maybe 8 oils hitting you on the first flag, and if you have 20k HP and someone negates your group, you literally just die before you can get healed again. And like also a thing is that if you have maybe 15 guys in your group on low health, the likelihood that one of them will die if you take a lot of sieges, for example, and get negated, is so much higher that one of them will die, and then from there the fight is just gonna slowly lead you like to a full wipe most of the time, because you can't really rest on the spot where there's 8 oils hitting you. So by just having everyone on a higher health pool, you just, as Vile already mentioned, you give yourself more time to react if you get bursted, for example, and just heal up again. Because yeah, if you have like 15 guys with 20k HP, I guarantee you that one of them will die when your healing springs get negated. So,
and as Anairi said, it's consideration for how it's affecting everyone else in your group, all the other roles. I mean, you can't just put it down to you're losing a little bit of damage or it's affecting your DPS. It's a matter of everyone, being brought into line and working together.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, I think like we can cover more in next episode and talk a bit about what in a raid now, what sort of builds and what sort of classes you want to run. But I think, in terms of recapping where groups and stuff have come from and kind of how they are now, that's a decent introduction to it.
Yeah. It'd be great to go over, like, we'll talk in future more about how to actually build your raid and put it together in the roles in the current meta. This was just kind of giving you an overview of how it has been, so that we can guide as to where it's going.
We also were trying to show you guys that if you look back at the history of the game, nothing really changed in the way bomb groups played. There were always some kind of meta. It doesn't matter what the skill or ulti, bats, banner, barrier, negate stalking, steel tornado, or meteor spam. And now is Destro ulti. So the reason why we decided to discuss this topic today is that there are a lot of posts on forum recently saying, oh, nerf Destro ulti because groups exploit them and it's hard to kill them. Yeah, that may be the case, but even if Destro is nerfed to the ground or completely removed, there will be just something else that players start to complain about, because good groups will always find something to use against higher numbers, just as good 1vxers will always find some build to use to fight 2 or 3 times their number. And players have played this way since the release of the game, no matter how many changes were made, for better or worse. Nothing has really changed since those time, and I don't really see how any upcoming patches will make a difference to that, to be honest.
I think if they remove
I
healing springs, it would have a really big impact on group play.
Don't tell anyone. Not many people
Don't
saw
tell
me, I
anyone.
was Sanct.
Keep it a secret. People won't realize
Yeah.
because it's not on their death recap. So
Yeah.
Everyone just needs to use
off topic quick,
rapid regen.
I think like a topic that would be quite interesting to discuss maybe in the next episode would be what we think how the game would change actually if they nerf like skills like Storm, for example.
Yeah.
Because I feel like there's so many threads like, oh yeah, nerf Storm, but people don't really
I haven't really
consider
thought
like what would happen if they nerf Storm. Like, do we really prefer that then? So I think it could be like an interesting topic.
Yeah,
Just
sounds
saying it
really
now
good.
before I
absolutely.
Yeah.
get it again.
Yeah. Ultimately, I agree with Anairi. Like, it's not going to change. The group meta has been strong forever. It's a few skills change here and there, but the gameplay remains mostly the same. Groups are always going to be strong. I think the biggest difference in the changes honestly affects the other styles of gameplay, and it makes them less viable in some ways. I really do think that's been affected, and that's negative. And we've said it before. We said it in the first episode. The game's going to be healthiest when everyone is considered, when every kind of gameplay can be played enjoyably. And I think that's where the changes hit most. Group gameplay is always going to be there. It's always going to be around. It's always going to be strong, no matter what skills you change. Like,
Actually, though, I mean, I
Yeah.
feel like the only playstyle that really is in a bad position is solo right now. I don't think that small scale really is in a bad shape. Like, if you build for it, you can still kill like 5 versus 20 easily. It's just like you have to like make some sacrifices. And maybe
Yeah.
you can't be like the top 5 versus 5 guild and use the same setup to 5 versus 20. You have to like decide, what do I want to do? Do I want to 5 versus 5 or do I want to 5 versus 20? And then you have to build for that.
Yeah, I mean, like back in the old days, as we discussed, you could basically pretty much against pugs just go with your 1v1 setup, just maybe with 1 or 2 extra AoEs, just on top of that, and you could still like kill them all just because they didn't really know how to play. But as we've said, there wasn't really any kind of counterplay if you then came up against a group, unless they reacted super slow and you managed to drop all your ultis on them before they could sort of react and burst them down. So I guess now we really need to stop because we're pretty far over half an hour, which we were trying to kind of stick around that sort of time. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to this sort of recap of how the game used to be, and the different skills throughout the ages of ESO. And I hope you join us next time for discussing what groups such as ours are currently using in terms of gameplay, classes, that sort of thing. If you have any comments or want to leave us some feedback, do so in the comments here or on the forums. And see you guys in game.